time to go back to basics. I'm starting a new video series that I've actually wanted to do for a long time, where look, I've been fucking around with sim hardware for too long now, and I'm ready to go back to my first love, the A-10. The A-10 has a very, very, very special place in my heart. You see, I really love machines that are especially ugly or they look a certain way because they're designed to do one specific thing really well. Like some examples might be like an F1 car or the French FAMAS or well, the A-10. The A-10's a fighter jet, but it really doesn't look much like, I'm gonna do this one tonight. It doesn't look much like a fighter jet. It looks like a goddamn ugly fucking pig with tusks ready to gore your guts out. Because it was designed to do one thing and one thing really well, and that's murder things on the ground excessively well. So excuse me 1 second while I open this. I need 2 hands for it. So today we are doing Bondstown Heritage Reserve Quadruple Oak. Now you may remember I've done the Triple Oak before, and I really like it. And they've somehow managed to jam an additional fucking oak into the bottle. So I don't know what a double oak is, let alone a triple oak, let alone a quadruple oak. But as you can see, I really am enjoying the bottle. So anyway, it's been a long time, guys. Let's see. I finished up my new job training, and I finished up my initial operating experience, and I was in a completely different base for 3 months, and now I'm home. I'm home for good. I'm based at home again, and I'm ready to get back on my bullshit with finishing up my cockpit and making videos. Also, a subscriber today. Hold on, let me look up his name. I'm going to give him a shout out. WF42978. I think I'm saying that right. WF44. I've already fucked his name up. Why can't you have a cooler, funnier screen name? Why couldn't your screen name be like, go bang your mom or something? It would have been a lot funnier. But anyway, this guy informed me that he is my 1,000th subscriber. So despite me telling you every goddamn video, I don't give a fuck if you like or subscribed. 1,000 of you crazy motherfuckers have subscribed to me anyway. And I don't know. I still don't give a fuck if you like or subscribe. I do these videos for my own sick, twisted enjoyment, but still, that's an accomplishment. So this one goes out to you guys. It's been a lot of fun, and it's about to get more fun. Damn, that's really fucking good. I really like the oaky stuff. Which reminds me, my friend asked me for some suggestions. I forgot to get back to him. Anyway, I'm rambling. It's my humble opinion that the A-10 was the absolute, well, is, soon to be was, sadly, is the most absolute violent, terrifying thing to ever take to the skies. I mean, nothing has ever been designed for aeronautical violence quite like the A-10 is. I mean, there was an F-35 pilot who came from the A-10, and I'm quoting directly here, he called the A-10 Chewbacca with chainsaws for arms. That's a real quote. Go ahead, look it up. The A-10's been featured in movies, shows, games, you name it. There are a lot of myths surrounding it, and I intend to dispel as many of those as I can. A lot of cute little factoids that I've found reading through these books, and I could sit here and I could be like, well, the A-10 was designed in 1972 as a result of the AX program, and that's fucking bullshit. This book, if you haven't read it, Boyd, the fighter pilot who changed the art of war, is all about, well, a man named Boyd. Boyd worked on the F-15. His best friend, who followed him closely, made the F-16, and he also trained the guy who designed the A-10. So he's the father of 4th generation American fighter jets. And there's a chapter in here, a couple of pages, that I'm going to read to you. So join me for the first ever story time with Solace. So get out your footy pajamas, snuggle up by the fireplace. I live in Florida, so this fire is fake because I live on the surface of the fucking sun, so I don't need any heat. And pour yourself a nice little hot cocoa or some bourbon, maybe get some whiskey in that hot cocoa. No one's going to tell. It'll be our little secret. And join me while I read you a couple of pages. I promise it's not going to take long. It's only this page, and these 2 pages. And that's it, just to where that little page break is there. But this chapter describes the inception of the A-10 better than anything I've ever read before. So, the year 1969 was a curious and bewildering one for America. It was the year Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, the year of Woodstock, and the year Sesame Street made its debut on public television. It was the year of war rallies and the year My Life Story broke the year a humiliated Lyndon Johnson left Washington to be replaced by an exultant Richard Nixon, who announced the beginning of troop withdrawal from Vietnam. The year was 1969. It was also the year that Pierre Sprey demonstrated just what sort of men were these acolytes, these men beginning to gather around Boyd and devote their lives to his goals and ideals. Sprey was even more bitter than Boyd over what happened to the F-15. He had come to the Pentagon from a defense industry solely because he wanted to have an impact on the bloated defense budget and be part of acquiring better weapons for soldiers and airmen. His first effort, born in high idealism and great hope, had been gold-plated by blues suitors and transmogrified into something far less than it could have been. The F-15 was a learning experience that prepared him for an even more difficult task. He was about to loose his considerable talents on developing another airplane, an airplane the Air Force did not want. To fully appreciate what Sprey did, one must remember that close air support, bombing missions that support ground troops, has never been a priority mission for the Air Force. Nevertheless, the Air Force officially owned the CAS mission, and no branch of service wants to lose a mission because losing a mission means losing money. The Air Force paid lip service to the CAS mission, making just enough effort to prevent the Army from taking it over. The best way to show how the Air Force looked upon CAS is it never, not in World War II, not in Korea, and not in '69, had an airplane dedicated to CAS. Air Force practice was to take one of the worst aircraft in its inventory and designate it as a close air support airplane. The F-84 in Korea is an example. In Vietnam, the Air Force used a cast-off Navy airplane, the propeller-driven A-10, which was forced on the Air Force by Secretary of Defense McNamara. The Air Force was embarrassed by the A-10, never mind that it turned out to be one of the best CAS aircraft used in combat up until that time. But in 1969, the Air Force learned the Army wanted to develop a new helicopter called the Cheyenne. The most startling thing about the Cheyenne was that it was so technologically complex that it cost more than an F-4. This frightened the Air Force. This meant the Army was going to make a run at taking over the CAS mission and the CAS money. In order to not be stigmatized as the chief of staff who lost the CAS mission, the Air Force had to develop a CAS airplane, and it had to be cheaper than the Cheyenne. The idea of a dedicated CAS aircraft was an anathema to all senior Air Force officers below the chief of staff. Blue suitors would fight the chief tooth and claw, but the fight would not be out in the open. The chief knew that his subordinates would pledge their support, but then, in the bureaucratic warrens that are the refuge of the careerist, would wage a sub-rosa war to sabotage the project. Thus, whoever directed the CAS program must be strong enough to stand against the generals. He would have to be smart and supremely focused with the self-confidence of a buccaneer and the armor of a dinosaur. The chief thought he knew such a man. He sent an emissary to Pierre Sprey with the question, "Were you serious about what you wrote in your introduction study about the need for close air support?" One page, one sip of bourbon, that's the deal. The question rankled Sprey. He would not have worked on 7 days a week for a year on something he was not serious about. Of course. Well, then you have the job if you want it. The big problem was Sprey's involvement could not be made public. He was still public enemy number one to the Air Force. People who cared about their careers were not seen entering his office. Few people spoke to him in the halls. If his role in the CAS project became public, the long knives would come out. No, Pierre Sprey would have to stay in the background. So Sprey's new job was a night job. He worked in systems analysis for the Secretary of Defense during the day, and then about 5 p.m. began his unofficial job for the Air Force on an airplane now designated the A-X. He led the technical design team, working for Colonel Avery Kay, an Air Force hero who had been lead bombardier on the Schweinfurt raid in World War II. Sprey wrote the specifications for the A-X. It was his responsibility, his airplane. The A-X was one of the most bizarre acquisition projects in the history of the Air Force, in that it was developed solely for bureaucratic reasons. The Air Force usually takes a deep proprietary interest in its new airplanes. They are touted as the best of the species, and another example of how the Air Force is the best Air Force in the world. But the A-X was the most unpopular airplane the Air Force ever built. Because it was unpopular, TAC and Wright Pratt and the Systems Command and all the people who gold-plated the F-15 did not want their fingerprints on it. The A-X was a leprous project led by a pariah. Usually, there are no cost constraints on aircraft design program. Politically, there are often many reasons to maximize costs. In all the history of the Air Force, the A-X was the single exception. It had to be cheap. It had to cost less than the Cheyenne. Few men are as methodical as Sprey. He began by wanting to know what functions were needed in a CAS airplane. To find out, he sought out A-1 pilots who flew CAS missions in Vietnam. These young officers were energized by the chance to have their recent combat experience considered in designing the first designated CAS airplane the Air Force ever had. None of this one-pass haul-ass stuff for these guys. To protect troops on the ground, they needed to loiter. They needed loiter time over target. They needed an airplane, they said, with long legs. Much of the time, hard to see targets in the smoke and the haze of the battlefield meant a CAS pilot must work low and tight and slow, so they wanted maneuverability at slow speeds. When friendly forces are in dire straits, they needed an airplane that can wreak hell, death, and destruction. An airplane, the very sight of which will turn an enemy soldier's bowels to water. So they wanted lethal weapons, preferably cannon. Working low and tight, as a good CAS pilot Working low and good, as a good CAS pilot must do, means the Goomers will shoot at them with everything from rifles to AAA to missiles. So they wanted an airplane that could take hits and still bring its pilot home. They wanted survivability. Survivability was an issue that particularly resonated with Spray. In doing research for his interdiction study, he read how more than 85% of all aircraft losses in World War II in Korea were from fire or loss of control. Several bullets in the right place, and crucial aircraft systems were burned or destroyed. It was almost impossible to get out of the airplane once they were damaged or on fire. Thousands of good men had died because of these bad designs, and Spray was determined not to let that happen on the A-X. Spray was fascinated by Hans Rudel, the legendary tank-killing German pilot of World War II, who is still considered the greatest CAS pilot of all time. Spray insisted that everyone on the A-X project read Stuka Pilot, Rudel's wartime biography, that told how he flew 2,530 fucking missions and destroyed 511 tanks. Now, just think about that for a second. That's one dude, 511 tanks, 2,530 missions in World War fucking II. That's, man, that guy, I would like to meet that dude. Because maneuverability is so important in CAS, Spray used Boyd's E-M theory and ideas about trade-offs. Time after time, Spray was now the one who took the charts and diagrams to Boyd and said, "Hey, John, check out what I'm doing." Boyd had the vision to understand the importance of CAS, although, like most fighter pilots, he had little personal interest in the mission. He glanced at the paperwork, slapped Spray in the back, and said, "Good work, Tiger, keep it up." The colonel, who was also Boyd's boss, detested everything about the A-X and openly criticized the project. As the man in charge of fighter requirements, his was a respected voice. Then, one day, the colonel from the chief of staff's office dropped by Boyd's office and invited him for a cup of coffee. The two men sat in the corner of the cafeteria, and the colonel said, in effect, "Your boss's comments about the A-X and his obstruction of the..." Oh, bourbon. Just give me a second. "And his obstruction of the project have reached the chief. Tell your boss the criticism has to end. The A-X project is about saving a mission for the Air Force." Boyd went to his boss, shut the door, and said, "There are high-ranking officers in the building who want you to lay off the A-X. The senior leadership is behind it." He emphasized the high-ranking and the senior leadership. The colonel ignored the message and continued his bitter denunciation of the airplane. A few weeks later, he was summarily fired and given 24 hours to clean out his desk. Spray exercised on the A-X perhaps the tightest design discipline that has ever existed on an Air Force project. He worked in strange confluence of serendipitous forces. Spray had an iron will and passionate belief about what would make a great CAS airplane, and all those Air Force decision-makers who could have gold-plated the airplane had a fervent desire to keep their distance. Tactical Air Command and Wright Pat didn't even attend the A-X meetings. Spray pushed through an austere design in which he got everything he wanted, almost. He lost two significant battles. He wanted a single-engine airplane while the Air Force insisted on two engines. I actually agree with the Air Force on this one. And he wanted a small maneuverable aircraft while the Air Force wanted a bigger airplane. In the end, the airplane was bigger than necessary, and its maneuvering performance was degraded by the insistence on carrying too many bombs. Once the A-X concept formulation package was finished, Secretary of the Air Force and the Secretary of Defense approved the design. Congress appropriated the initial R&D money, and a request for proposal, RFP, was sent out. In the RFP, Spray told the contractors they could not respond with the usual 2-foot-tall stack of documents. The response had to be limited to 30 pages and confined to pure design. No smoke and mirrors. Even more unprecedented, airplanes from two contractors would be picked by the Air Force would supervise a combat-type fly-off between two flying prototypes. Specifications demanded the fuel and the engines be in separate parts of the aircraft. If you don't know, most fighter jets actually have their gas surrounding their engines, which is, not great if you get shot near the engine or the fuel tank for obvious reasons. Fuel tanks had to be explosion-proof. To make sure this was done, sections of the wing and fuselage would be fired at with Soviet weapons, and, oh yes, this must be done under simulated flight conditions, with wind blowing over the prototypes being fired upon. Wright Pat said no facility existed for such tests and that the resulting explosions would be too dangerous. Spray told them to take the propeller and an engine off of World War II B-50, attach them firmly to a solid stand, run up the engine, and let the prop wash go over the fuselage and wings. They did, and several years later proudly took credit for what they termed the world's first ballistic wind tunnel. Rather than having flammable and vulnerable hydraulic controls, the A-X would have mechanical cables and push rods, redundant dual cables, to control the flight surfaces. Spray insisted that the A-X must be able to maintain flight, even with half the control surfaces shot away. As for armament, the A-X was built upon a radical new cannon that fired banana-sized depleted uranium bullets. To protect the pilot, the cockpit was surrounded by a titanium bathtub. The Air Force loathed everything about the A-X, which soon became known as the A-10. Jokes were made that it was slow and it suffered bird strikes from the rear, and that instead of carrying a clock, the cockpit had had a calendar. The aircraft was so ugly it was called the Warthog. Many in the Air Force said no airplane could perform or survive in combat as the airplane was supposed to perform. It would be almost 20 years before the A-10 had a chance to demonstrate just how wrong its detractors were. And if you're wondering what that is, we're talking about the first Gulf War, where the A-10 flew, oh God, I think it's a 93.5% mission capable rate, and they had several thousand vehicle kills. It's a staggering statistic. So to give you an idea of just how important the close air support mission is, I want you to picture something as a mental exercise. Imagine you're a soldier, you're a U.S. soldier, you're 18 years old, you're enlisted, and you're overseas in the desert fighting an enemy that genuinely hates you, and they're screaming at you in languages that you don't understand, talking about how you're a demon and literally an affront to existence. And you're huddled behind some rock, clutching your rifle, doing your best to put up a good fight. And then some fucking gigantic flying fucking pig shows up with a giant gun that shoots 30mm bullets and makes the enemy's position, temporarily for about a good 2 seconds, the most inhospitable place to live on the face of the fucking planet. That's what the A-10 is, and that's why I love it.
That'd be a lot easier to... Okay. They ain't alive no more. That's... Damn! Holy shit!
And Pierre Spray knew this too. Part of the A-10's design was to make it as absolutely foreboding and horrifying for an enemy combatant to see as well. Imagine, again, you're a soldier, but now you're on the enemy side, and you know what the A-10 is. And you're trying to fight these people, these demons who you literally think shouldn't even exist, and you see one of these things roll in. You know what that is, and you know what's going to happen to you.
Please tell me you got that.
Yep. Nice. Good. Fuck their house.
I remember back in 2015, they were talking about trying to sell the A-10. They're like, well, if you're going to retire the A-10, then at least let us sell it to other countries. And Congress was like, no. We're not selling the A-10 to anybody. Could you imagine our own A-10s shooting at friendly troops one day? Jesus Christ. Perish the thought, man. There are a lot of myths surrounding the A-10, and some of them are true, and some of them are not so true, and I'd like to dispel a couple of them. One of the really, really interesting ones is that the A-10's engine is actually a TF-34, which if you're an airline nerd, which I am not despite flying them, the TF-34 you might recognize is the same engine that's on a CRJ CL650, CL600, CL6... the CRJ before the CRJ 700 and 900, whatever model that is. Same engine. Ironically enough, though, the A-10's engine is actually D-rated. That is to say, the CRJ has more thrust than the A-10 does. If you ask any A-10 pilot what he wants, they all say the same thing. More power, bigger engine. We've got enough gun, we've got enough armor, we've got enough weapons, we need more engine power. And, well, I got that. I have a funny little anecdote for you. I once asked an A-10 pilot, what's V&E in the A-10? If you don't know what V&E is, V&E stands for, well, V sub NE stands for velocity _ never exceed, aka max airspeed. The pilot looks at me and he goes, what's V&E? I'm like, maximum speed. And he goes, oh, I don't know. Don't worry, you're not going to get to it. That's what he said to me, word for word. I don't know. Don't worry, you're not going to get to it. This motherfucker flies the A-10. Doesn't know what the maximum speed is. Don't worry, you're not going to get to it. A really interesting thing about the engine, though, is that the spinner is actually big enough such that it covers the entire core section of the engine. So there's not really any great pictures here, but if you don't know how a jet engine works, it's a giant fan, that's the fan, and then a core section, that's the core section, and the core section powers the fan, and most of the thrust comes from the fan. So if any FOD is ingested into the engine, it goes to the fan, but it won't go through the core, the part that actually powers the engine. So you can fuck up the fan blades all day long, land the A-10, it'll be just fine, replace the fan blades, and put it right back into existence. It's really, really difficult to get damage into the internal parts of the engine. So, and that's a purposeful design choice. In fact, everything you see about the A-10 is a purposeful design choice, right down to the gun being offset and the landing gear being off to the right, so that I think it's the 7 o'clock barrel of the A-10's gun fires to make the center line of the barrel firing down the center line of the aircraft, so there's no left or right yaw, and the barrel is as low as possible on the airframe to decrease recoil. If you know how to grip a handgun, or you know how the way a handgun recoils, that'll make sense to you. The lower the barrel axis is, the less muzzle flip you're going to have, which is why the Chris Vector is designed the way it is, if you know what the Chris Vector looks like, which is another machine that looks really, really ugly and is designed for a very specific purpose. You're going to notice a common theme with these things. Everyone talks about the titanium bathtub that is surrounding the cockpit. It's an A cockpit, by the way, surrounding the A-10's cockpit. Yes, that is true. There is a titanium tub that surrounds the cockpit, and there's also Kevlar to protect from shrapnel that's embedded into the walls. But the titanium bathtub, I believe, I'd have to check on this, accounts for 17% of the aircraft's total weight, which is ridiculous. Like A-10, no fuel, no armament, just the basic empty weight of the aircraft, the zero fuel weight, if you will. And the bathtub is 17% of that. It's a lot of fucking weight to keep the pilot alive. The front windshield of the A-10 can take a direct hit from a 23 millimeter round and still keep the pilot alive. That's a little ridiculous too. So, like the book talked about, the chapter I just read you, the Air Force never loved the A-10, and that extended throughout the entire A-10's life. Case in point, the A-10 was mostly upgraded with hand-me-down parts. The stick of the A-10 is actually the same stick of an F-16, and the throttle of an A-10, the left throttle, the right throttle of the A-10C is off of a Mudhen, an F-15 Echo. So they never gave the A-10 any new parts of its own. I mean, you recognize that RW off of any fighter jet. It's all just hand-me-down parts for things they could just take off the shelf and just fuck onto the A-10, which, it's fine. Ain't broke, don't fix it. The gun. Whew, lad, let's talk about the gun. There's a lot of myths surrounding the gun, a ton of myths surrounding the gun. Let's see. The fire rate is 3,900 to 4,100, I believe. It's a little variable between those. There was a myth I heard from a friend once that the reason the A-10 retains its shells, doesn't eject the spent shells, is because that a hotshot pilot during testing decided to roll the aircraft while firing the gun, and the spent shells got into the engine and destroyed the engine. They lost the aircraft. Bullshit. That's not true at all. The A-10 retains its spent casings because it's required for the weight and balance of the aircraft. That is to say, even with the spent casings retained, the aircraft likes to sit on its fucking tail because the gun's ammunition accounts for so much fucking weight in the nose of the airplane. Now, what the gun did do in initial firing was create such a fucking mess on the windscreen, they had to change the composition of the propellant of the round. And worse still, the exhaust gases from the A-10's gun got into the engine and actually flamed out the engine. I don't know if they lost an aircraft over that. They might have, but they had to do something about that. So they added, let's see, these little strakes right here to keep the exhaust gases, and there's a scoop in there too, to keep the exhaust gases underneath the aircraft instead of going up into the engine. And they also made it so that when you actually pull the trigger in the A-10, it actually turns on the igniter plugs in the engine to guard against engine flame out. So the A-10's gun is touted as being incredible, and it is incredible. And a lot of the A-10's detractors these days are like, well, modern battle tank armor has come so far, the A-10's gun's not really relevant. Well, I don't know about that. So the original A-10 gun fires a 5-to-1 combat mix of 5 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, which are depleted uranium, which is really fucking hard metal, to 1 high-explosive round. The idea being the armor-piercing incendiary would punch holes in the armor, and the high-explosive rounds would go through those holes and murder the crew inside. See, that's why I'd never want to be a tank driver. There's no such thing as an anti-tank weapon. There's only anti-motherfuckers inside the tank weapons. Like, nothing actually destroys tanks, just kills people inside them. Anyway, I digress. Okay, well, modern tank armor can survive an A-10's gun. Well, is it still useful? Yes. All you have to do is load the gun up with nothing but explosive rounds and just pepper the tank up nicely, and it's going to blow off treads, it's going to take out sensors, it's going to damage external guns, it's going to destroy basically all the things that make the tank good or mobile, and it's going to turn it into a 100-ton coffin sitting on the battlefield, and the people inside might still be alive, but that tank is functionally useless. They call this a mission kill, and I really wish DCS would model it. And now you probably know the A-10 is indeed being retired. The Air Force has finally won its, 50, 60-year fight now to finally retire the A-10. Congress has blocked all their attempts at doing it. And sadly, how they're finally doing it, how they're finally getting rid of the A-10, is they stopped making ammunition for the gun. I heard this a couple of years ago from an A-10 pilot who flies at Fort Wayne, Indiana. He told me that's how they're finally doing it. They just stopped manufacturing ammunition for it. So there is a finite amount of 30-millimeter rounds for the thing, and once it's out, it's out. It's no more rounds. So that makes me sad. Pouring out for the A-10, man. Let's talk about survivability for a second. There are a lot of myths about survivability. So I'm not going to lie to you, man. The A-10 is still technically a fighter jet, and it doesn't matter how much armor you put on a fighter jet. If you hit it with a missile, it's probably not looking good for it. So while the A-10 is more robust than most aircraft, it's not going to fly you home missing 1 wing, 1 tail, and 1 engine. Yes, it will fly like that, but what the people are leaving out about that little factoid is that it'll fly long enough to get you to a safe place to eject, not a safe place to land the airplane and put it back into service. So, survivable? The A-10 pilots called it, what do they call it? Get home ability is what they call it. So, maybe, the missile that would normally down any other fighter jet will still take an A-10 out of action, but it'll let the pilot limp it to a safe area to eject, or at least to a place where he can do a belly-up landing, which, interestingly enough, let's talk about that for a second. The reason the tires stick out of the pylon when the A-10 has its gear retracted is actually because it was designed to land belly-up. I actually met an A-10 pilot who did such a thing. Geared up, landed an A-10. He told me it only took them 3 months to put it back into service. 3 months. Gear up, landing in the airplane. 3 fucking months. Put it back in service, back on the flight line. Simply incredible. The redundant push rods and everything in the aircraft are actually, yes, they're there so you can fly without hydraulics. It's not fun to do that, but it can be done. And the reason that the tail is split like that, which is a design you really haven't seen since World War II, is, yes, in case you lose one of them or one of them gets shot to pieces and is no longer functional, you have 2, and it's still enough to get the aircraft to limp home. Now, one thing that I heard once and I haven't heard since, and so maybe if there's a real A-10 pilot who watches this video, you can tell me all the ways in which I'm fucking wrong, or a nerd or whatever, or maybe a crew chief who worked on it or something. I read once that the Maverick was actually the primary weapon of the A-10. That when the Maverick was designed, the A-10 was the primary platform for it, and the A-10 was designed to carry the Maverick and be the primary user of the Maverick. So, I don't know. Is that true? I'm not able to confirm or deny. But I will tell you, the Maverick loaded on stations 3 and 9, 4 and 8. I think it's stations 3 and 9. Whatever. The point is you can carry 6 Mavericks total. Now, I talked to an A-10 pilot in real life, I flew with actually a couple of months ago, who told me that the A model A-10 could not carry the triple Mavericks on the triple ejector racks. He said if you did that, there was an electrical glitch and they just wouldn't fire. They'd be useless. So they only carried 2 and 2. Now with the newer C model, I heard the reason that they only carry 2 and 2 is because the inboard Maverick on either side of the aircraft would actually melt the tire when they fired it. The rocket motor of the Maverick would fucking melt up the tires. That's why they only carried Mavericks in pairs on either side instead of doing triples. So, interesting factoid. Like you can see right here, they only carried the outer 2 ones, and the inner one, they just wouldn't carry it. Another myth I love busting is that the A-10 was designed around the gun. Well, it was designed around a gun. It was originally going to have a 20 millimeter internally mounted gun and then have conventional weapons hung on 6 pylons. But, you know, Pierre Sprey wanted to go big or go home, so the A-10 was actually fully done and built, and the gun was still being manufactured to spec to fit in the aircraft. So the whole plane was built around the gun. Yeah, it's half true. It's more like the plane was built around having a gun, and then the gun was kind of purpose built for the aircraft. Fun fact about that: they tried to put the GAU-8A Avenger, the A-10's gun, into a pod and fuck it onto an F-16. And when the F-16 fired that pod, it almost shook the damn aircraft apart. So nothing else is going to carry the A-10's gun, just the A-10. Yes, this is a real picture. The gun's the size of a fucking Volkswagen Beetle. Whew, lad. Interestingly enough, the A-10's competitor, the YA-9, that's it right there. What does that look like? A frog foot. Isn't that amusing? It's funny how function conforms to form when it comes to these kinds of specific missions. So, revisiting survivability for a second. More than 50% of the damaged A-10s return to service within 4 hours. That's fucking ridiculous. That is insane. I mean, I cannot imagine an aircraft more serviceable and easier to work on than that. I do know the A-10's cost is $14,000 per flight hour, which you may say $14,000 is a lot of money, but compared to the $44,000 a flight hour it costs to fly an F-18, along with 4 man-hours of labor, just in the form of inspections, if nothing goes wrong and breaks on it, you look at it that way, it's actually pretty fucking cheap. I mean, it had to be cheap. The Air Force would never take it otherwise. Recall I spoke earlier about the manual reversion system. This chick took a man pad, you can see the damage there, and managed to fly it all the way home and land it with the manual reversion system, which you're not supposed to do, but she felt confident in doing it, and she pulled it off. And there she is looking at it like, nerds, could have done better. And I think that's it. Thank you for listening to my video of me jerking off the A-10 for however long this video is going to go, probably 20-30 minutes. But yeah, the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to start putting together a video series about the basics of flying the A-10. It's time to go back to basics, and so this being the first video, it's really not required. It's just me talking about how awesome the A-10 is, and if this shit doesn't get you wanting to fly the A-10, I don't know what will, bro. So that's all there is to it. Next video, I'm going to start covering the systems a little more in depth, and then after that, we're going to move on to aircraft handling. I'm going to kind of approach this as if I were teaching a student to fly. I was a flight instructor for 1.5 years. I am a real-life pilot, though I am not an A-10 pilot, so, you know, there's that disclaimer. But thanks for 1,000 subscriptions, too, even though I still, to this day, do not give a fuck if you like or subscribe. But thanks for doing it anyway. Anyway, new videos to follow soon. Thanks for watching.